Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. It's nice to have a nice big crowd. My name is Janet Forrest. I'm one of the adult program coordinators here at the Nantucket Atheneum. And tonight, our guest is Anthony Amore. He is an expert in security matters, especially those related to art and homeland security. And presently, he is the Director of Security and Chief Investigator at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, where he's in charge with the ongoing efforts to recover 13 works from the museum on March 18th, 1990, so 30 years ago. He's published several books. In this past November, his third book, The Woman Who Stole Vermeer, The True Story of Rose Dugdale and the Rossborough House Heist, will be published by Pegasus in the US, UK, and Ireland. And he also publishes a blog on security matters titled Big Security. So without any further ado, welcome, Anthony. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Janet. Thanks for having me. It was a really great idea of yours to ask people where they're watching from, because it's really neat to know that there are people all over the place that are tuning in. It's an honor to be speaking to you all. My name is Anthony Amore, and I work with the Gardner Museum, and most of you have probably heard of the Gardner as the site from which 13 works were stolen, as Janet mentioned, going on 31 years now in March. And I just want to give you a little background to give you a sense of where the book I'm going to talk to you about came from. So I spent the first 15 years of my career in homeland security agencies. And then when I was done doing everything I wanted to do there, I made the switch over to museums and came over to the Gardner in 2005. Making a switch from working to basically prevent terrorism to preventing art theft and investigating a major art heist, because I'm the Gardner's investigator, required that I get up to speed in art theft really quickly. So I started looking at every art heist I could find, and I've written a couple of books based on a lot of the findings that I made during that research. But one of the first people I encountered when I started on this journey was a woman named Bridget Rose Dugdale. And I was fascinated by her because by nature, I'm fascinated by outliers. And at this point, I've looked at 1,400 art heists. And in those, I have found that it's always men who steal paintings, especially masterpieces. It's always men. Once in a while, you'll find a woman who grabbed a small painting out of a gallery somewhere or that sort of thing. And that's bad too, don't get me wrong. But when you're talking about a major art heist, like a headline grabbing heist, no women ever do it. Just like every other awful crime, it's always the men. It must be our small frontal lobes and our oversized adrenal glands, but we commit the bad stuff. So when I saw Rose Dugdale had stolen a Vermeer, I was really taken by it, but there wasn't a lot of information about her out there. And every time I came across her name over the years, one consistency was that nothing about her seemed to match what I had heard previously. So what I should say, it was an inconsistency about her that was playing with my mind over years. And finally, a few years ago, I said, you know, I've had enough. I want to learn everything there is about Rose Dugdale. So I took a 2.5 year plunge into learning about her life. And I was so fascinated by what I found that I decided to write a book about her. And that's the genesis of this book, The Woman Who Stole Vermeer. And what I'm going to do now is bring up a slide presentation. So I'm going to have to fumble around my screen for a second. Please bear with me while I do this. Probably mess it up once or twice, but I'll get there eventually. Okay, here we are. Okay, in slideshow. I'm sorry it's taking me so long.
No, take your time.
Okay. Yeah. Slow computer. Okay, it should be coming now. So we shared the screen, and from current slide. There we go. Boy, that's very slow.
If you try from the beginning,
Yeah,
there you go.
there it is.
Perfect.
Okay, it's got to be my computer must be lacking memory. Okay, so this is Rose Dugdale, and there we go. I knew that was going to happen. So there's the book cover, and I'm really hoping that I inspire you to own one for yourself. So here's Rose Dugdale, and Rose was born in 1941 in Great Britain, and she was born into enormous wealth. Her father was a name at Lloyd's. They had a large estate in Devon in Great Britain, an estate called Yardley Farm, and it was just the idyllic type of upbringing that you read about, rolling green hills and horses, and every accoutrement of fine living was what Rose was born into. Her mother was sort of a taskmaster, but both her parents were loving parents. They sent her to the finest all-girls school, a school called Miss Ironsides. When she was there, she would live in this really beautiful apartment in a upper crust area in Chelsea. And she went to school with students of her ilk, as people were wont back then. And in 1958, Rose turned 17. And it was a really important year because based on the aristocracy, based on the wealth and the standing that she was born into, it was important to her family that Rose be a debutante. She be presented before the Queen with young women of her standing. What makes it especially interesting, though, and this seems to be a theme in Rose's life, that the right things or the wrong things happen at monumental times. 1958 would be the last class of debutantes presented before Queen Elizabeth II. The Queen and her sister agreed that it was time for this to stop. They felt that wealthy people were buying the opportunity to be debutantes rather than going through some sort of class system based on their family lineage and stuff. And so 1958 would be the end. So it was that much more consequential to the Dugdales that Rose participate. But Rose did not want to participate. She saw the debutante season as a meat market. She did not wish to be paraded in front of young men, often soldiers of equal footing in society, to be judged as a potential wife. But this is what her family wanted for her, and this is what most families wanted for their daughters back then. Their goal was for her to be a socialite, and to just live a life of leisure with her well-heeled husband, and that's the expectation. So Rose put up a fuss, and finally the parents had to make a concession to her. And one of the things I love about writing books like this is to look at the way the world was in its entirety at the time historical events happened. So if you go back to 1958, it's hard for us to believe now in 2021 that this was the case. But what Rose's parents acquiesced to in order for her to be a debutante was that she could attend Oxford. Now, I'm sure there are a lot of parents watching me speak tonight, and I think all of you would agree in modern day that if your daughter wanted to attend Oxford, you would be behind it 100%, unless you were a Harvard lineage family or something. But that was her goal, and her parents grudgingly accepted that she could attend Harvard. So she went through the season, despised it every bit of the way, and then attended Oxford. And at Oxford, she took a PPE, so she studied philosophy, politics, and economics. She didn't excel, but she was thought of as a smart student, and she was very dedicated to her studies. But she wasn't a rebel, except in her classes, she would defend wealth. She would defend capitalism. And the one thing that she did that was sort of rebellious was the Oxford Union at the time was for men only. And she and a friend dressed as men and went to the Oxford Union and were not caught, but they made a big to-do of it. So that's Rose on the left with the glasses and her friend on the right. And you can tell this was a monumental thing because they they had themselves photographed as they prepared themselves as men for the day. And I just love Rose's face in that picture because she's so determined. And that's Rose Dugdale from start to finish. No amusement about what she was about to do. She was serious and determined the entire way. So Rose finished Oxford, and after graduating, she went on to get a master's degree in philosophy. And interestingly, of all the countries in the world, if you asked Rose Dugdale today, now that she's 80, which is her least favorite, it would be the US with Israel second. But in her youth, after she got her bachelor's degree, she came to the United States. And because all incredible art theft has some odd connection to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, much to my dismay, Rose went to Mount Holyoke. So she went out to Mount Holyoke, and as you can see from this photo, she embraced American culture at the time with her cowboy hat and plaid shirt and her cowboy boots. And she did not shun her wealth. She had her little sports car shipped over to the US, hardly the sort of thing that she would condone later in her life. So she has a sports car brought over. She's well known amongst the other students. She has a very, she sort of seems to be rebelling against her rigid upbringing. She's known to have a very sloppy room. She dresses rather sloppily, but she takes this sports car and drives across the country. She's really well known for being a crazy driver too, but she's pretty bold and independent, and it's a unique thing for a person to do back in her day, but she did it. So after she finished at Mount Holyoke, and as an aside, if any of you are Mount Holyoke grads, I want you to know that your archives department is fantastic. They kept great records on her long after she had left, and they were a great assistance to me in writing this book. So upon finishing at Mount Holyoke, Rose went to Bedford College in Great Britain and got her PhD in philosophy. Took on the hard work all the time, wrote a thesis on Wittgenstein, and after graduating, became an academic. And so she was always on campuses. And of course, it's at a really monumental time in history. Now it's, in the mid 1960s, and things are happening around the world, and things are happening on campuses. And even though she's no longer a student, she's going to these different sit-ins and demonstrations. And her students really like her. She's a young professor. She's very active. She's not one to sit home. She's always there on campus doing things alongside the students, and takes great pains to be involved in all of the different things that are catching the attention of people in the turbulent 1960s. Here's a picture, here's Rose's passport photo, and I'm showing her pictures because I like people to see the transition of a young Rose to the Rose that she becomes. As the years become more turbulent in the West, Rose really starts to rise. And 1968, as many of you watching this are old enough to remember, was a remarkably eventful year, mostly tragic. Of course, in the United States, you have the assassinations of Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King within a number of weeks of each other, which is just even still hard to believe, just repeating that out loud. You have protests around the world and in the United States at the Democratic Convention. You have revolutions around the world. And in 1968, Castro's revolution was still rather young. And he decided he was going to try to win hearts and minds, and invited a large number of students from the West, particularly from the United Kingdom, and some from the United States, to come to Cuba and to see his revolution in action. Now, I don't have a photo of Rose, but she went. And it's interesting because she's now 27 years old, approaching 28, and she's going there with a bunch of 21, 22-year-olds. So I know that's only 5 or 6 years, but 5 or 6 years at that point in life is a lot. So she's significantly older than the vast majority of the people she goes with. Again, I don't have a photo of her in Cuba. God, I wish I could find one. But to give you a sense of the students that were there, on the right is Christopher Hitchens. And Hitchens was in Cuba while she was in Havana. And I just am rereading his autobiography, Hitch 22, and he talks about being there. And every account I've read of these trips to Cuba, which were called the Cinco de Mayo camps, are pretty much the same. A lot of the students, I shouldn't say most, but a lot of the students were underwhelmed by what they saw. Hitchens talks about noticing, Castro would give these speeches every day in the hot sun for 2 hours, and everything he said would get a standing ovation, but it was like a duty to stand and cheer, whether you felt it or not. And they were led by people who were in the front of the crowd. They would stand and everyone else would have to stand constantly. But they found the speeches to be overlong and boring and uninspiring. They had to work a lot while they were there. And they saw a lot of things that were inconsistent with Castro's claims. For instance, Hitchens talks about having seen a lot of prostitutes, even though Castro talked about prostitution being completely abolished in Cuba. So it was a great experience for a lot of these students. Unlike, say, Hitchens, Rose really took to it. She just loved it. She enjoyed the speeches. She really enjoyed the people, which is interesting because she was what you would call now a one percenter. And she took to these people who lived in not relative poverty, but poverty, and really enjoyed being with them and danced with them and sang with them and tried to speak their language. So it's really a monumental time for her. So while a lot of students weren't blown away, she really was taken by the whole socialist Marxist type movement. Of course, when she's finished and she returns to Britain, she's a changed woman. Now, I wouldn't say that her trip to Cuba was the biggest change in her life, and she would never have been the same person if she hadn't gone. Rather, I would say it was influential in her life. When she returns, she sells her apartment in Chelsea, and she buys this storefront in Tottenham. And Tottenham's a rough and tumble working class area. And Rose sets up what's called a tenants union. And a tenants union or a claimants union is the sort of place where you would go if you were having trouble, say, getting an apartment, a single mother trying to get an apartment, or a family who's lost their work with children who have no place to stay, or having trouble getting the benefits from the government. Rose would be sort of your representative, and she would go with you to the offices, and she became famous pretty quickly because she would go in and start slamming on the table, and people were afraid she was going to toss the tables over. She would bring families and turn them into squatters, just take apartments if they were available. She had no time for bureaucracy. So she was pretty famous in the area. Some people thought of her as like a fairy godmother because she would give them money too. All the while, Rose's wealthy parents are still sending her money there. She's their daughter through and through for her entire life, and they still support her. While she has this storefront, now it's 1969, she meets a man named Walter Heaton. And Walter is this dynamic, tall, older gentleman, handsome, who's a leader of men, and he's a union leader. And they're at a protest together on behalf of a union, and they meet each other. And Walter immediately starts working with Rose at the tenants union. And they become fast lovers and are inseparable. You never see Walter without Rose. They're at every protest, every event. They're fighting for people's rights together. One of the problems, though, is Walter's married. So I think he's 13 years older than Rose. So he's in his early 40s when Rose is in her late 20s. And he lives with his wife and his daughters, but that doesn't seem to bother them. It's the dawning of the age of free love, and they carry on their affair right in Walter's house every night, including the marital bed. Walter's wife would come home and find them together, compromising positions. And at night, they would be up all hours of the evening, talking, trying to learn Gaelic, while Walter's wife sat aside alone, wondering what was going on, really just humiliated. It really creates a paradox to me because throughout, this is a feminist story. Rose is one of my goals is for her to become a feminist icon of sorts, but she has no problem humiliating Walter's wife. But this is just Walter and Rose seem to have been meant for each other. as they're carrying on, 1969 coincides with a rebirth of the Irish civil rights movement in Northern Ireland. And Walter and Rose take to this naturally. And this is their storefront, and you can't help but obviously notice the tricolor above the windows and door. That must have been a startling sight for people in Great Britain at the time, to see the Irish flag above this office. But they were soon going to protest on behalf of the Irish, the Catholics in Northern Ireland, and they soon began running guns to the IRA. But because of all of their shenanigans, it's a term that I don't usually use, but it's apt in this situation, they're running out of money. And Rose is spending a lot of money on Walter, and Walter, despite his wearing socialism on his sleeve, takes to allowing Rose to spend an awful lot of money on him. He's buys a Mercedes with her money. He's dressed in the finest suits. He becomes known for how for his sartorial splendor walking around the streets of Tottenham. You could see the two guys on the left there would probably really notice a guy in well-appointed suits, this tall, rugged figure. And Rose, perhaps out of guilt, I don't know, gives about 20,000 pounds to Walter and his wife, which is a heck of a lot of money, especially in 1969. But one of the problems is, as we go into the early 70s, is that Rose has spent everything that her family has sent her, and they need money. Walter and Rose need money. So where will they turn? They're not about to go get day jobs. What they do instead is go to the source that Rose always turned to for money, her parents. And one weekend, while the family's at the Epsom Derby, which is a long holiday weekend, sort of like going to the Kentucky Derby, Rose and Walter and another guy break into the family home at Yardie Farm. And it's a clever idea. They go in and they steal all of the art that their father has. They're not masterpieces, but they're valuable pieces. They're a finer stuff you buy in a finer art gallery. And they steal expensive antiques. But their idea is much better than their criminal acumen, because right away the police know it's them. And the clues that lead to them are, first, the house staff on Yardie Farm didn't hear any of their numerous dogs barking. And they concluded that's because the dogs all loved Rose and didn't bark at her. Second, she knew exactly what to steal, and they stole all the valuable antiques except one, which was a gift that Rose had given her mother. And thirdly, the only room that wasn't touched was Rose's bedroom. So they weren't great at committing crimes, but they got the stuff and got away, but were arrested rather quickly. They took about 125,000 pounds worth of stuff. So this is Rose and Wally had some protests, as they were wont to be. And you could see this interesting photo here. And I love this photo because it tells so much. Remember, this story was taking place in the 60s and early 70s. And Rose becomes international news because of this art theft that she just committed with Walter and another man. Even in the United States, it's in the newspapers, this PhD from Oxford has stolen 128,000, I think it was, dollars worth of art from her family. What made her turn this way? And of course, all the commentators and journalists of the time couldn't imagine what the truth was. They instantly surmised that she had fallen under the spell of Walter Heaton. But what I've learned in the research and from speaking to Walter is a stunning thing, is that no, the case is that the men fell under her spell. Rose was the leader. She was way ahead of her time, and to the extent that no one could imagine such a scenario, but that was the truth. And this picture is so telling, because Rose is talking to a reporter here at their offices, and you could just see the way Walter's looking at her. You can tell that he is just bemused and beguiled by Rose Dugdale. So when they're arrested for breaking into the home, Walter, who has a criminal history, knows this is a bad thing, right? He knows this portends poorly. And you can see how grim he looks coming out of the police station. But look at Rose. And again, it's really, it tells 1,000 words, because Rose is excited. Throughout her life, Rose it seems, tries to shed this image of an aristocrat. Even interviews she gives in her later years, she talks about, he tries to play down her Downton Abbey upbringing, but getting arrested gives her some bona fides. It brings her closer to the people, and you can see she's happy here. When they go to court in the early 70s in Britain, the wheels of justice moved rather quickly. So they were arrested, they went to court, and they were convicted quickly. But at court, they both did something they learned from the Black Panthers in the United States, is that when they were able to give their statements, they would use the court as their bully pulpit, and they would get up and they would give political speeches. Walter's is interesting because it focuses on himself, and you can see his outsized ego. And I've met Walter electronically. He's 94 now. He's a really great guy. He's very helpful. I really enjoy knowing him. But I get a chuckle out of his speech in which he responds to the judge's sentence of 6 years in prison with the words, "Not since Christ has there been a greater travesty of justice." And Walter's a great guy, but he did a house break. It's hardly Christ-like. Just sort of elevates himself. Rose gets up and gives a very lengthy speech and talks about classism and talks about wealth and capitalism. And her poor embattled parents are there, but her admirers are there too. But the press is there. And she gives a long speech about the oppressed and the people who don't have. And she looks at her father and says, "I love you, Daddy, but I hate everything you stand for." And the poor father is just taking this in with his wife. And he's a tough guy, Colonel Dugdale, but this was very hard for him to see his daughter speaking this way. So when the judge turns to her for her sentencing, she's fully expecting to go to jail. And the judge says, "I believe you've fallen under the trance of this man." You know, the same sort of chauvinistic benefit, I guess you would say, that the media was giving her. And he said, but you're responsible for your actions. And he gave her a 5-year sentence and a large fine, but he suspended her sentence and said, "I think it highly improbable, if not impossible, that you will offend again." And he set her free. And that's really amazing because it is such a misjudgment by the justice who handed down this light sentence, this slap on the wrist to her. And she says it herself, this is pure class justice. And she storms out as Walter is wheeled off to prison. And she declares her undying love for Walter and assures him she'll visit him always and be by his side. When she leaves court, you know, she relishes in the attention from the media and sees the photographers and raises her fist. Like on the cover of the book, then she bears down and gives a peace sign. And she protests on behalf of Walter. She pickets outside the prison and outside their offices. And you can see she has free Wally Heaton, the people's best friend, sign behind her. "Your fear is greater than ours." Walter was in solitary confinement for some time till they could figure out how they were connected to the IRA, if at all. So she's protesting and visiting him for weeks, but only weeks, because soon enough, just a couple of months in, Christmas holidays pass, and without saying goodbye or without any indication she was going away, Walter never sees Rose again. She leaves. No goodbye, no letter, nothing, no message, just gone. And where Rose goes is to Ireland. So she crosses the Irish Sea, and interestingly, immediately takes up with another man. Almost immediately upon arrival, she meets an IRA man named Eddie Gallagher. And Eddie Gallagher is known to most people as Mad Eddie Gallagher. And that is because he's so rogue and he's so brash and rash in his decision-making that he can't really be controlled by the IRA. So one of my goals in this book was to make sure it was very fair-minded. I don't give you my opinion on what I think of the Republican movement versus the Loyalists. I don't give you my opinion on whether Rose is a terrorist or a freedom fighter. But the one thing you have to say about the IRA is that whatever they did and whatever you think of it, they were strategic and they had a decision-making process. And Eddie had no time for decision-making processes. Like Rose, he had no time for bureaucracy. So he would just go do things on his own. And often it would be upsetting to the IRA because they might be working on a ceasefire in a certain area or trying to negotiate for a prisoner. And meanwhile, Eddie's out doing what he was doing. Rose loved it. That was they were a perfect pairing. And Rose was a great subscriber to the movement known as direct action at the time. Direct action, when I speak to younger students, college students and such, I explain it's the difference between a person who's on Twitter and a person who's out in Portland attacking Powell's bookstore because they don't like a book that's inside the store. You know, this is taking it to the street and taking it to the people. That was Rose and Eddie. So what they do, incredibly, in 1973, is they come up with this really dangerous, dastardly plan. Rose goes to a helicopter rental place in Ireland, poses as a journalist and says she needs to rent a helicopter for a tour over these certain lands for an article she's writing. And they agree on a price, and on the appointed day, Rose shows up and sees the pilot. And as she nears the helicopter, 3 men come running out with milk churns. And in these large milk churns are packed explosives, and lots of explosives, dozens of pounds of explosives that will create an enormous amount of damage. So heavily packed with explosives that 2 of the milk churns have to be left behind because they're so heavy. And the 4 of them board this aircraft and they make the pilot fly at gunpoint to a part of Northern Ireland called Strabane. And at this particular time, Strabane is the most bombed place during the Troubles. And the goal is to fly over a Royal Ulster Constabulary and drop the bombs on this police barracks, which is really an attempted mass murder. An untold number of police officers and anybody in the area would have died based on the size of these explosives. So they fly over to Strabane and they order the pilot to hover. He's under duress, of course. They drop the bombs, but fortunately, one that lands doesn't explode, another lands on the rocks, and one lands in the water harmlessly. So there's no explosion. They fail in their attempt to kill everybody in sight. The press interviews the leadership of the police, and they report with a chuckle that they watch with amusement at the futile attempt to bomb, and they laugh it off. But what's really important is that the police were not amused by this. This would have killed brothers and fathers and uncles and sons. This would have been a horrific bloodbath. As it was the first aerial terrorist attack from the British point of view in British history. It was the first bombing on British territory since World War II. So it's a really significant event. And special branch officers in Great Britain are hot in pursuit. And they pretty quickly, based on evidence they find in a hotel room, determine that this is the same Rose Dugdale they were watching for gun running when she was in Britain. So much for the Justice Park deciding that she wouldn't offend again. So the police put out this wanted bulletin, and you can see they take some shots at her. They put a really unflattering photo, of course, and they describe her as having a masculine appearance with sallow eyes and dirty and untidy clothes. And they're looking for her. So Rose and Eddie are going from Republican safe house to Republican safe house throughout Ireland. And Eddie's welcome, Rose is mostly welcome, but not everywhere, because, you know, for many people in Ireland, for everyone in Northern Ireland, this was their life. The Republican struggle was their life. It was life and death. This was not a game. And here was this rich British woman that they suspected might just be, you know, going through a phase and having fun at their expense, you know, and sooner or later, like Patricia Hearst, would go back to her wealthy life. So many people looked at her skeptically. She wasn't always welcome, but they weren't captured by the police. Rose talks about her disguise being a skirt and heels and how torturous that was for her. But they were on the run and being hotly pursued. I mentioned that the confluence of events in Rose's life really played an important part in terms of her notoriety. And this is true also because of these two young women. On the left is Marion Price, and on the right is her sister, Dolores. And some of you might have recently read a book called Say Nothing, a fabulous book by Patrick Radden Keefe about these two. They play a role in this story as well. So Dolores is the leader. She's about 20, and Marion's her younger sister, and they're born into the IRA. Their father was an IRA soldier in the 20s. Their aunt lost her hands and her eyesight to IRA explosives. She was helping the IRA. The mother was an assistant in the women's branch where they would do essentially administrative work, care and feeding type stuff. And they grew up at their father's knee hearing stories about the IRA when, you or I were hearing stories about, fairy tales. So when they were of age, they were fully committed to the Irish struggle. They started in 1969 trying to follow Dr. King's nonviolent protest approach, and it didn't work. Everywhere that they would have these peaceful protests, they were met with violent cops who were on the side of the loyalists. And of course, Bloody Sunday took place where peaceful marchers were shot by British paratroopers. And I think it was 13 people were shot. Forgive me if I don't have that number correctly. So it turned into a violent escapade. And that's when the bombings really began in Northern Ireland. Finally, the IRA said, if we want to send a signal to the people of Britain, bombings can't just be something they're reading about in the newspapers that happen over in Northern Ireland. We need to bring them home to them. So Rose was the first CO, the first commanding officer, they call it an OC, in the IRA. And she and her sister led 4 men over to Great Britain with explosives, and they set off 4 car bombs in Great Britain, metropolitan areas, including Scotland Yard and an army recruiting station, but most notably in front of the Old Bailey, the famous courthouse in London. And they did give a warning so that civilians would be harmed, but the warnings didn't work. And hundreds of people were injured and maimed in the bombing at the Old Bailey. I liken it to the Marathon bombing, but there were no deaths in the Old Bailey bombing, but so many people were injured and hurt badly. It's a horrific scene. The sisters make their getaway with the 4 men. They get to the airport and they're caught at the airport because someone informed on them. And they're immediately arrested. The police know who they are. They know their family lineage. They're locked up. And soon enough, they're tried and convicted for the bombings, given life in jail. But unlike other IRA bombers, they are not allowed to go back to serve their time in a Northern Irish prison, nor are they treated as political prisoners. So political prisoners would have the right to wear street clothes and associate with their compatriots in prison and such, have more visitors. Rose and her sister were treated as criminals, and this and the location of their imprisonment led them and their compatriots to go on a hunger strike. And this was the age of hunger strikes. But these two really grab headlines because they're beautiful young women, and that makes for great coverage. The government of Britain doesn't know what to do with their hunger strike. What do we do with these 2 young women who are starving themselves? We can't just give in to their demands. This was a horrific thing. The people will be upset. So the government decides to force feed them. And hopefully you'll purchase the book and you'll see what force feeding was like. It was brutal and it was torturous for them. Later in life, both would have PTSD from the episode. And it didn't help their health. In fact, they were dying. The Price sisters were dying. And it was, they were cause celeb in the Western world. And the question was, what would become of the Price sisters? Soon thereafter, at a museum in Hampstead Heath in Great Britain, in the middle of the night, there's a robbery. Someone smashes open the grate over a window at the Kenwood House, which is this really beautiful former residence of the Guinness family that created the beer. And they break into this one gallery and they touch nothing, including Rembrandts, and steal this one Vermeer. And they take it back out. They lock the museum doors from the outside so the guards can't get to the police quickly. They cut the phone lines and they make off with this painting. There are no witnesses or nobody who will come forward because at the time, Hampstead Heath was an area where the LGBTQ plus community would go to meet up and congregate because people were so much more closeted back then, and no one was going to testify that they were in the area in 1974. It's February of 74 now. So there are no leads in this crime. And the police are getting letters from multiple people that are of no use. But finally, the police and the media get a letter from thieves who say they have the painting and give some good bona fide information about it and say they will return it if the Price sisters are moved to Northern Ireland as they request. And then they follow up this credible letter with another, and in it they include a swatch of canvas from the side of the painting. So the face of the painting is not damaged, but the canvas is checked by experts to be the canvas from the Vermeer. So the authorities know they have the right thieves. And you'll have to buy the book to figure out how that investigation goes. But 6 weeks later, in the middle of the night, a young woman, a French woman with speaking broken English, approaches the employee entrance to this unbelievably beautiful, huge home called the Rossborough House in County Wicklow in Ireland. And Rossborough House is the longest house in Ireland. It's tough to fit the whole thing in a photo, but they're on the backside of this building. She goes to the door, and one of the servants' sons answers the door. He's 14 years old, and sees this lovely young French woman speaking broken English, saying her car has broken down, and she used the phone, and the kid can see the car in the distance. So he opens the door for her, and two men with automatic weapons flood into the house, barging by her. They subdue all of the house service and put them in a room. They don't injure them at all. They're kind to them, but they lock them up. And then the men and this French woman go to the study where they find the owners of the house, diamond ears, named Sir Alfred Bite and his wife, Lady Clementine Bite. And these people, if Rose is the 1%, these people are the 1/10 of 1%. The wealth is astronomical. And the art collection they have is like a museum's art collection. And in fact, today, the Rossborough House is a museum, essentially. And something phenomenal happens, something unprecedented. Once the Bites are tied up, the husband is hit in the head and he's hog-tied on the floor. The wife is tied up and she's dragged to the basement and thrown on the dirt floor. All the while, the intruders are calling them capitalist pigs and yelling epithets at them. The woman starts giving the men directions as to what paintings to steal. And that's because it's not really a French woman, it's Rose Dugdale. And Rose knows what's in this house, and she knows great paintings because of her upbringing, not just because of her wealth, but because her mother was involved in the arts. So you have these thuggish, violent men being led around by a woman who is telling them what paintings to take, and she chose very wisely. She pointed out 19 paintings, including Vermeer, 3 Rubens, a Goya that was very important to the Bite family, Van Eyck, and a number of other paintings. And they take them and they cut the phone lines, like at the Kenwood House, and they make their getaway, and they're gone. They've taken 19 paintings in the biggest art heist in the history of the world at the time. To give you a sense of how much information you had to have known about the Rossborough House, when the detectives were dispatched and told that there were millions of dollars worth of paintings stolen, the detectives said there aren't millions of dollars of paintings in all of Ireland. I mean, this was not common knowledge, but for someone like Rose Dugdale, it was. So here's the painting that is stolen that evening, that was a Vermeer. And that's the painting called Lady Writing a Letter with Her Maid. And like so many Vermeers, like all of them, frankly, You can study it for hours and just come away with more questions. And I love this painting because you can see the maid looking out the window, and you can't tell, is she worried, is she concerned, or is she just looking out the window? It's just such the mystery of Vermeer's works. And I had looked at this painting for a long time before I realized on the floor there was a crumbled up letter with an envelope, and you wonder, was that a mistake the lady had made and thrown it on the floor, or was this an angry letter that had been sent to her, perhaps from a lover, perhaps from someone who was seated in that chair, which is askew? So it's the hallmark of a great Vermeer, and it has a really amazing connection to the guitar player, which I just showed you, that I hope you'll buy the book and read about, because you'll be fascinated about the history of these two paintings. Here's the Garda at the house after the theft. Here's the crime scene, and most of the frames are left behind. And that happens often in art heists simply because they're cumbersome and heavy. Paintings on their stretcher, as most of you know, are not heavy at all, but with the frame on them, they become heavy. So most of the frames are left behind. Now, like the theft from her parents' house, Rose is not only the only woman to pull off an art heist, but she's done more than one. She's just an unbelievable figure in the annals of crime, not just activism. She plans out how to get the art well, but she doesn't plan the getaway well. So what happens is she plans that they will take the paintings to this far off cabin that they rent out at a farm in County Cork, figuring no one will find them out there, but not understanding that people who live in these rural areas notice everything, and they notice strangers and outsiders. And soon a farmer who rented out the cottage notices their broken down car and the license plate, and he alerts the authorities, and the authorities come and they arrest Rose, but the three men who did it with them are nowhere to be found. And it's poignant to me because I wonder if Rose stayed behind willingly, hoping to finally be arrested and imprisoned. And I know this is pop psychology, but I do feel like Rose really wanted to belong. She was never accepted by the IRA during this time. And I feel like it's possible that she wanted to go to prison to establish how hardcore she was, because she never turned in the men. And when she was arrested, she did all the precautions the IRA would have told her to do, including not even acknowledging her name. But adding to the poignancy, when Rose did this, she sent letters again demanding that the Price sisters be moved. But what happened was the Price sisters told the media through their father that they didn't want to be moved this way. They did not want to be moved at the expense of the art. And furthermore, Dolores loved art, and she asked that the paintings be given back. So again, it's this plan by this rogue group of people trying to support the IRA, but not acting strategically. So Rose goes to court and she's tried and convicted quickly. Again, she uses the court as her bully pulpit. And when she is asked how she pleads, she says proudly and incorruptibly guilty, and then goes on to give political speeches twice because she's also tried for the helicopter event. In true Rose Dugdale fashion, that's not enough for her life. It had to go on in dramatic effect. She started feeling unwell, and she snuck a jar of her urine to her lawyer, who found that she was pregnant. And she became the first woman in Ireland to have a baby in prison. And of course, with his wife and the mother of his child locked up, Eddie Gallagher couldn't just let that stand. And when you purchase the book or you take it from the library, as I mentioned earlier to Janet, I don't get royalties when you take it out of the library, but when you read the book, you'll see what he did, which was, again, worldwide news, to try to win the freedom of his Rose Dugdale. After she was released from prison in the 1980s, Rose took up some causes on behalf of Sinn Féin and ultimately was accepted by Sinn Féin. So you can see her at a Republican march and the soldiers letting her hold his rifle. You see her on the right signing the sympathy book when Castro dies, which is sort of a full circle for her. And amazingly, though she was never accepted by the IRA, nowadays she is often seen with Jerry Adams, and she works in education for Sinn Féin. So ultimately, she was accepted. And when you read The Woman Who Stole Vermeer, you'll read the story of Dolores Price and see the way that her life intersected with Rose and then took a different course. And it's just a fascinating, poignant story about two remarkable women who betrayed the social mores of their time, the expectations, even from the liberal media, who just couldn't believe women had the fortitude to do the bold acts that these two heroes or anti-heroes, however you wish yourself to view them, could do. So that's the tale of Rose Dugdale in a nutshell. Of course, the book is far more detailed, and I really hope you pick it up. The nuances of Rose Dugdale's life will really take you back to a different time. It will leave your mouth agape at the things that she did in the rapid succession she did. And I think you'll also, regardless of your political standing, find her to be somewhat of an inspiration and someone whose story you can't put down. So I thank you so much for joining us here at this Nantucket Talk, and for listening to me now. And Janet, I'm not sure if we have time for a few questions, but I'm willing to answer a few if there are any.
Yeah, that would be great. Let's see. So this is kind of a comment that you brushed over, so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about it. But they were going to ask a question about the kind of rough analogy to Patty, how this might compare different.
I only heard bits and pieces of that, Janet. You're breaking up, but I think it was about parallel between her and Patty Hearst. Such a great question.
Just comment a little bit on that. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you for asking that. It's a great question. They happened simultaneous to each other. Rose was dramatically different, though. So though both came from great wealth, Patty Hearst was kidnapped into doing what she did. And then when she became a sympathizer for the Symbionese Liberation Army, by her own accounts, it was because she had fallen for the man, the leader of the group. That's a sharp contrast to Rose, who ran directly towards this action. She had to run away from people to get to it. And it wasn't because she fell for a man. It was the men were falling for her. Eddie Gallagher was also completely enthralled by Rose. Eddie was younger than her. So this was a man following a woman. Rose dominated the men she was involved in. And then lastly, even in terms of when they were caught, Patty Hearst pled not guilty. She had, I think it was F. Lee Bailey was her attorney, the finest attorneys representing her to get her off. Rose went in and had a public defender who asked off the case. She was happy to go to court, happy to plead guilty, and to say, as I mentioned, proudly and incorruptibly guilty. So she's a sharp contrast to Patty Hearst, and I've always been interested since reading about Rose that people who wrote about Patty Hearst never drew the parallel, but it's undeniable. But Rose comes off as more of her own woman, I guess is the best way to say.
Mm-hmm. Great. If people have questions, you can put them in the Q&A. Here's another one, perhaps obvious, but after she robbed her family, did they disown her, or did they have any more connection with her over the years?
Wonderful question. They never disowned her. Even when they died, in their will, they left her the same inheritance that her brother and sister got. When she was in prison and had her son Rory, the mother sent things for Rory because when Rose had to give him up, eventually he went to a Republican family, and Rose's mother would send care packages to them. They tried from the day Rose was born to the day they died to be full parents in her life, no matter how she tried to run from them.
Mm-hmm. Let's see, there's another question here. Do you think, you comment on this, but do you think that Rose suffered from mental illness? They the person commenting said that, you know, this is kind of known in British families and in aristocracy. So what do you think?
I don't think she did. In fact, if you read the book, you'll see I talk about an examination that was done of her when she was standing trial to see if she had some sort of mental health issues. I mean, I'm loath to speculate about somebody's mental health. I can only say that I am completely convinced that she was acting independently, under her own free will. It seems really improbable that someone would do these things, but without some sort of episode, but it's true. I mean, some people are committed to their cause. She was deeply committed to hers, never institutionalized. And my guess is no, I don't believe, and this was the finding of the psychiatric evaluation, that she didn't have a mental health issue.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from Judy. Did she and Walter ever reconnect?
No, she did send him a letter when the baby was born. That's it. Walter still talks about her so incredibly fondly. I'll tell you, it's interesting. So Walter's 94 and he's a very active friend of mine on social media. And he's vocal. And when I wrote the book, he was my biggest worry, bigger than press reviews, bigger than the New York Times review. I was worried Walter Heaton would come out and say this book is about a lot of gobbledygook. But Walter loves the book, says it's dead on, and it says the best book he's read, which is my favorite review. So Walter's, when he answered my questions though for it, has not a single bad thing to say about her. He speaks about her so fondly. It's romantic, sort of. But he speaks through his wife about how great Rose was, which is really interesting.
Yeah, that's a complex relationship, huh?
Sure is, sure is.
We have another question from Victoria. What happened to the child she had with Eddie?
Her son Rory is alive and well. He's a well-adjusted young man. He's really nice. I really liked him. I like him. I think Rory is a wonderfully pleasant young guy, and he's not in any trouble, and he's fully employed, and seems to be enjoying his life robustly.
We have a question from Susan. Why do you say all art heists are connected to Massachusetts?
Oh, well, I've given speeches before on this. I wrote a book called Stealing Rembrandts, and when I give the speeches on that, interestingly, my argument is that the three most important art heists all happened in Massachusetts. The first, in my mind, obviously being the Gardner, because it's the biggest heist of anything in world history. The second being a theft from the MFA in 1975, in which a Rembrandt was used to bargain somebody out of a massive prison sentence. So it's the first time it was used as a get out of jail free card, which is a precedent since then. And the third being the 1972 theft of a Rembrandt from the Worcester Art Museum, which is the first armed robbery of a painting. So it all roads, when it comes to crime, sadly lead back to the Commonwealth. Not Nantucket, but the Commonwealth.
Let's see, it looks like we have one more here. Oh, this is interesting. Is there any chance she was possibly remotely involved, in parentheses, mastermind, with the art theft at the Isabella Gardner Museum?
Absolutely, positively not. And I'm glad you asked that, though, because Janet and I had a little conversation about documentaries before you all joined. And there was a documentary recently on BBC4 tying the IRA to the Gardner heist. And I can tell you, I'm glad you asked that, no connection between the Irish, the IRA, Ireland, you name it, to the Gardner theft. It is a bunch of hooey, just makes for good television. There's never been one single piece of evidence tying Ireland or Whitey Bulger or any of that stuff to the Gardner theft. So no, but if you buy The Woman Who Stole Vermeer, you'll see the case I lay out that she was involved or perpetrated the Kenwood house theft. So I believe she stole 2 Vermeers, and that's the epilogue of the book. I lay out an investigator's argument that she did both. You know, I should mention too, Janet, before we go, that the book is available everywhere. Your local bookstores in Nantucket. It's available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble right now. Brick and mortars have been having a slight bit of trouble getting distribution, but I really love when people support their local bookstores. But if you're in a rush, it's available on Kindle and Barnes and Noble tonight. So I really hope that you pick up the book. It was a labor of love. I'm very proud of it. And I know you won't be disappointed. And down the road, when you see the miniseries based on the book, you'll be glad you read it.
Mm-hmm. We do have a couple more. I have a couple more questions. Do you have a few minutes?
I do.
Joanne asks, how did you become interested in researching Rose Dugdale?
Well, I'm an art theft investigator, and I'm a big, you know, when you're looking at 1,400 art heists, what interests you are the outliers. I like to profile things. One of the people that blurbed the book is John Douglas, who the book and the show Mindhunter are about. I like to profile art thieves and speak to them. I've spoken to dozens and dozens of art thieves, and Rose is an outlier. And I love just looking outside the normal curve. So that's what led me down. And then once you start reading her story, and I was digging up info about her, it became my life. I mean, she's just so fascinating. I think you'll agree if you read the book.
Yeah. Have the 2 Vermeers ever been found?
They have. And yeah, again, I'm plugging the book, but that's what I'm here for. You got to read how they recovered. Believe me, your mind will be blown, and it'll lead to more questions than answers.
Okay. And I think, we just have one more. And this is having to do with the Gardner heist. They want to know, have psychics or mediums ever been consulted in that case?
Consulted, no. Have I been contacted by hundreds of psychics and mediums? Yes. Has any one of them ever said anything that was even sensible? No. No. And I'm not being insulting. I can tell you that the first book I ever thought of writing was to write about the crazy leads and how demonstrably nutty they are, especially from psychics and mediums. So no, but a little hint, whoever asked that question, you definitely need to read this book, The Woman Who Stole Vermeer. Definitely. Remember the name Nella Jones.
Good. And just, we've talked about the book. Do you have anything coming up? I know you're just wrapping up this one project. Anything on the horizons for you in terms of writing or projects?
Yeah, so I write that blog that you mentioned. It's a Substack account called Big Security. And I write about things like art theft, and I also write about like security implications of the thing I'm wrestling with right now, and I don't have an answer, is if you have a show of force of 25,000 soldiers at an inauguration, is that a peaceful transition of power? Like those are the sorts of things I wrestle with on that website. But I'm researching another book now. It's another type of, this book is called The Woman Who Stole Vermeer because no one had heard of Rose Dugdale, but it's really Rose Dugdale in her times. This next book that I'm researching right now is about a deep state actor from the 50s. And I don't believe all that deep state stuff, right? But this guy was like an undercover, and no one still really knows exactly who he was. And he was involved in some art recoveries, but also some really dark stuff. So that's what I'm working on now. And the research and the writing are the fun part. When I finished with Rose, I really felt sad to be saying goodbye to her. So I enjoy coming to speak to you guys about her.
Yeah. Well, hopefully for your next book, we'll be all back in the Great Hall and you can speak from our beautiful stage to a live audience.
Your lips to God's ears, Janet. Yes.
We have lots of great comments. People are excited to read the book.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Anthony. Thank you